Hello, fellow authors. I am Matty Dalrymple. I am the author of the Nat Connor suspense novels and suspense shorts and Lizzie Ballard thrillers. And I also podcast, write, speak, and consult on the writing craft and the publishing voyage as the Indy author. And you can find out more about me at mattydalrymple.com and at theindyauthor.com. And I'm here with Nat Connor. Hey, Nat, how are you doing?
Hi, Matty. It's great to be back.
It's lovely to have you back. And
Yeah.
why don't you just take a half minute and let our viewers and listeners know a little bit about you and Kindletrends?
Yeah, sure thing. So my name's Nat Connors, and I am a romantic comedy writer and a data scientist. And along with writing romantic comedy, I spend a bit of my time making Kindletrends, which is a data newsletter for independent self-published authors. It comes out every week and every month, and it will give you up-to-date information about what's going on in your genre. Covers and blurbs and trends in tropes and themes and stuff like that.
Great. And I had invited you onto this little video program because we were chatting about the changes to KDP Categories. And I thought it would be fun just to get together and share some thoughts about it. So some of our viewers and listeners may know that recently Amazon made a change to the category situation. I think that the overall change, and please jump in and add more detail as appropriate, is that you used to be able to have up to 10 categories, only a couple of which you could actually add via the KDP dashboard. The other was you had to actually request via EP customer support, and that they are changing that now. So you have 3 and only 3, and you have complete control over setting them. Any refinements to add to that overall description?
No, I think that's a really good summary, Matty. I mean, the thing that I have noticed, and I know a lot of other commentators have noticed, is that the categories that are presented to you in the KDP dashboard are now not the older BISAC categories that used to be there for quite a long time. They are the actual Amazon categories. Many suggest that this is kind of a good thing because it makes it a bit easier for authors to work out exactly where on the Kindle store, their books are going to end up. As a lot of people know, the BISAC categories are kind of publishing industry focused rather than reader focused. So they're kind of more of a back end stock management kind of a thing. So this change, having Amazon focused reader facing categories directly under the control of authors, is in principle going to be a good thing. One of the things that I think we need to look out for, however, is changes and additions to that category structure, because, of course, if you're writing a particular type of book and there is no particularly good fit in the Amazon category structure for your book, it's still going to be a problem for you. The example that has just recently changed is in what's called Lit RPG. Lit RPG novels, as many of your listeners and viewers may know, are quite popular at the moment, but for a long time there wasn't a Lit RPG category. And so a lot of the lit RPG books were ending up in urban fantasy, which sort of arguably maybe wasn't a great fit. Now, Amazon has actually just introduced a lit RPG category over the last few months. And so that's a much better fit for people who are writing that genre of book,
Yeah, I had thought that this was going to be way more complicated from the point of view of somebody maintaining categories on KDP. And it seems pretty straightforward to me. I've only changed one book, but as an example, just to give some background, so the old categories that I had for my books, the Nat Connor suspense novels and Lizzie Ballard thrillers, were fiction, thriller, supernatural, fiction, ghost, fiction, mystery and suspense, women sleuths, fiction, thriller, suspense, fiction, medical, and fiction, thrillers, general. And I think those were probably BISAC categories, not necessarily Amazon categories, but in some cases there were comparable ones. And so I went in to make and then I went to my book page, The Sense of Death, a first Nat Connor suspense novel, to check what categories were showing on the actual product page. And it was psychic thrillers, ghost suspense, and psychic suspense, none of which I think I chose. And now, so I went in and I went into the KDP dashboard. I went through the category drill down. And what I ended up with for the ebook for The Sense of Death was these all start with Kindle books. I'm going to have a question about that. Then mystery, thriller, and suspense. That's the category, I guess. And then the 3 subcategory and placement selections I made were suspense, paranormal, psychics, crime fiction, murder, and thrillers, crime. Those felt very obvious, like in a way that it never
Mm.
seemed obvious when I was picking categories for KDP before. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it's reassuring, Matty, that you could choose some categories that make sense to you as the author, because, if they don't make sense to you as the author, then how are they going to make sense to readers? I think it's going to be easier for authors in some genres than in others. I've often said, and I know I've said this to you before, that some genres have a really obvious and clean set of categories in the Amazon structure, and some sort of don't. So I think in this case, for some authors, it's going to make life a lot easier, and I think you're definitely one of those. One thing to note, though, about what you were saying, and this is something that's often occupied my attention, is that a lot of those categories conceptually have a lot of overlap. Maybe this is a little obvious, but Amazon categories are not exclusive. So I think you said you were in thrillers-crime, and also in, what was the other one you mentioned?
Crime fiction, murder, and
Yeah.
the third one is suspense, paranormal, psychics.
Yeah. Okay. So crime fiction, murder, and some of the other, so there's a legal thrillers category and so forth. We know that those, what are called placements at the bottom level, we know that there's quite a lot of overlap between them. And in some cases, now that you've only got 3 categories to play with, you're going to have to make a judgment call about which of those is the best, But in truth, I think there will be a lot of books that are that have been in both of those categories. I wonder if we're going to see a bit more differentiation between those categories, though.
Yeah, well, the thing that struck me when I was choosing these is that the first one, I mean, they're the suspense novels, so
Mm,
going mystery, thriller, suspense made sense.
mm,
And then when I got that far, one of the choices was paranormal, and the other ones kind of didn't make sense. So I picked
yeah,
paranormal, and then there was the final selection I could make was psychic. So that was fine. And then when I went back, there really wasn't anything else behind suspense that made sense to me. So I thought, oh, I'll just go to a different, I'm
yep,
not even sure what level this is. Crime fiction. Okay, crime
yep,
fiction, murder. That kind of makes sense.
yep,
And then thrillers, crime. So
yep,
in a sense, they're more spread out across, there's more variation in the higher levels of the hierarchy than there were when I
yep.
was doing it before. And I could go down to like suspense, paranormal, and it seemed like there were more choices. I don't know if that's specific to this, but once I started going through, it wasn't like there were a ton of options. It seemed like there were obvious
Yeah.
options, and there were about 3 of them. And then when I was
Yep.
done, I was done.
Yep. Well, that's reassuring, isn't it, Maddie? Because if, as you say, if there are some clear options which are a good fit for your book, and there's about 3 of them, so you don't have any kind of agonizing judgment calls to make, that's good. And that kind of shows that in your genre, at least, the system is working kind of the way that we as authors would like it to be. I think it remains to be seen whether that will be the case for all genres. Because as we know, genres are always changing and new styles of book are coming out all the time and all that kind of thing. But for the moment, it seems encouraging. And, the feedback that I've seen from author communities has been cautiously optimistic, I think is probably the best way to put it. I think there's a couple of other things that I would like to note for listeners about what's going on. The first one is Amazon's language around the words category, subcategory, and placement, I think is quite interesting. And maybe this has always been the case, but I just never noticed it. So Amazon says that the category is the highest level thing. So mystery, thriller, and suspense is a category. Everything under that is a subcategory, except for the bottom level, which is referred to as a placement. Now, the
Oh,
term
okay.
placement, yeah, were you familiar with this word before this
Oh, I
change?
was
Because
not.
no, exactly. So it's probably, when we're communicating with Amazon, it's probably worth adopting that language to make sure that we get our point through, if you know what I mean. So the bottom, from now on, I'm going to make sure that when I'm communicating with Amazon reps, I refer to the lowest level category, the lowest structure that my book is in, as a placement, because that's the language that they use.
And it sounds like you won't have much need to communicate with KDP customer
Well, we have,
service anymore, because you can't do this. Oh, if I ask for some number more, I'm going to get them. And also
yeah,
that, as I understand it, there's not any authors aren't determining the categorization except in their home market. So for me, it's US. And then I guess that Amazon is just picking for the other markets if it's the same categories, if they're comparable categories. Do you know how that works?
Yeah, that's a good. No, Matty, I think you know how just before we started recording, we were talking about how a lot is not yet known, and the impact of this on the non-US markets, the UK, Canada, France, Germany, Spain, etc. I think that's not yet known. So one of the things that I think is going to be very important is exactly that there are some differences in the category structures we know between US and UK. For most authors, I'm thinking it's not going to make a huge difference, but there will be some situations where it does actually make a big difference. For instance, to use a romance example, there is a billionaire romance category in the UK, I believe, in ebooks, whereas in the US, there is not. There is only a billionaire romance category in print books, I think, from memory. So there are some, I mean, if you're a billionaire romance author, this is actually quite important because in that situation, how do you make sure that your book gets in billionaire romance, you know? So yeah, there will be some changes there, and yet it doesn't seem workable to present authors with a separate set of category choices for every single market that their book is in. You know, that doesn't seem workable either. So I think there's still going to be some things to shake out there. And that's one of the reasons why I think we also talked, Matty, if now is a good time to mention it, about the list of all of the categories that I give away for free on the Kindletrends site. And one of the really interesting things that I think I'd mentioned to you is that there are no additions or deletions of categories since April. I've actually just finished running this big crawl of all of the categories, and that's available for free on the website. Oh, thank you. Ready? Mm-hmm. Yep, this is the one. So if we can put the link in the show notes, that would be great. But you can go and get this as a spreadsheet or as an online spreadsheet like this, and it will show you all of the categories in the US ebook structure. The thing to note is you might think that they would have added or subtracted some, but actually there haven't been any changes since April. The only change that I would note is that the romance, mystery, and suspense, let me make sure I get this right. The romance, mystery, and suspense category has been renamed romantic suspense. So if you're a romantic suspense author, don't be fooled. This is actually the same category because it's got the same category ID. So if your book was in the old category, it's going to still be in the new category. It's just got a different label stuck on the front. And I think people I've talked to who write romantic suspense are generally happy about this because they think romantic suspense is an appropriate title for the category and it's going to resonate better with readers and so on and so forth. However, I suspect that there will be some category changes in the sense of additions and deletions, both for print books and also potentially for the UK and German markets and the other international markets as well. I'm going to be doing an analysis on that over the next month or so. So if and when I find some interesting stuff, we can get together and talk about it again, I think.
Well, you mentioned a couple of things there that I wanted to tap into. And one was that, and this is totally, I'm totally willing to accept that this was just confusion on my part, but I used to find it very confusing that they had books and then they had Kindle books. And so like sometimes it seemed to me like you could put your Kindle book in a books category, but you couldn't put a print book in a Kindle book category or something like that. And now when I went in to my Kindle book for The Sense of Death, I was only presented with Kindle book categories to choose from, which I think is a big improvement.
Yeah. Those rules, I think, were quite confusing. And I suspect they're still changing. I wouldn't be surprised if some of those things change as a result of the self-service thing that's happening at the moment. And as you probably know, Matty, there are also some other structures under the Kindle store, like Kindle Short Reads, which is popular to categories, particularly for romance, but also for speculative fiction and so on and so forth. And the Kindle Short Reads categories are determined, at least in part, by the length of your book. If your book is, I always get this wrong, but basically if your book is less than novella length, then you are eligible for either the 90-minute or 2-hour set of categories. And there's a sort of a parallel set of categories under there: romance, science fiction and fantasy, mystery, thriller, and suspense, and so forth. So it remains to be seen what the rules for getting into those are going to be under this new self-service structure. That is, whether they stay the same or whether there's some new thing introduced or whatever. So going back to your earlier point, I think we'll have fewer reasons to communicate with Amazon support reps just about categories, but I think there's still going to be a host of other things that we'll be talking to them about.
Yeah. Well, I hesitate to bring this up, but because I think this could be a whole other separate discussion. But when I started writing the Ann Kinnear suspense shorts, at the time, the Kindle Shorts reads was quite hot. And I thought, oh, this is great. I'm going to be in the Kindle short reads. And I think I still am, but it's very difficult to find it. Like for a period of time, Kindle short reads was more obviously displayed in the sidebar. And then it kind of disappeared. So if there's a way that gets resurrected through this or made more visible or something, I would be happy because I think that was a really nice feature. As a reader, I thought it was a very nice feature. And of course, as an author, I like anything that makes the readers happy.
Yeah, very much. Yeah, well, I mean, I think the Kindle short reads categories are still very popular, particularly for short romance in the 90-minute and 2-hour categories. I've got some good friends who are in that space, and the production values and so forth are very high. And of course, it's a challenge. As an author, it's a challenge to fit a complete story arc into a relatively short space like that, So I think those categories are still fairly popular, but you're right, visibility outside them, as it were, is difficult. So getting someone interested in the idea of a shorter novel below novella length, that is quite challenging. And a lot of the time, I think we have to rely on off-Amazon means to do it. So through our newsletters and through podcasts, so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think that the things that I like about this, a couple of other things that I like about it is that I do think that the simplification is better for authors who are trying to do the right thing for the readers and worse for people who are the bad actors because I think that there was a lot of, people taking advantage of the categorization to get themselves into categories just so they could get a bestseller ribbon. And I don't even pay attention anymore. I've gotten the bestseller ribbon, but I would never advertise myself as a best-selling author unless somebody has the words USA Today or Wall Street Journal in front of, or New York Times or something in front of their name. I'm not really going to pay attention to that. So I like that idea that this is, I think we're being more restrictive to the people that we would want to be restricted. But the other thing I realize I like about it is that before when I had, I was going searching for 10 categories to apply to each of my books. And then by the time I was done. I didn't want to mess with categories anymore. But now I can imagine that for 3 categories, and many of them are going to be the same across my books, just with slight tweaks, I could really dive into it. And one thing I noticed, I was just poking around in Publisher Rocket before we got together. And I noticed that one of the categories that one of my books is assigned to is very heavily KU. And I thought, well, that's interesting because I'm not KU. Maybe that's a problem. And so I think that with less choices there, authors can spend more time truly understanding the categories that they're putting their books into. Any thoughts about that?
Well, I think in principle, if we can go to a book details page on the Kindle store and just see all the categories that a book is in there on the book details page, I think that's going to be a good thing because it does make research a bit more straightforward as well. So I can imagine a situation where you're looking at your comps, Matty, and you're looking at an Ann Kinnear book and you scroll down and you go to the also boughts and you're looking at the books that were bought by people who also bought the Ann Kinnear series. And you can then, for each of those, say if you see a new one, you can then go to that book details page and see the other categories that they're in, like you do in Publisher Rocket. So I think it will, because there are fewer choices, I think it is going to make sorting out in your head where your books should really sit a bit easier. And as you say, it does mean that you're going to be able to focus on fewer categories and maybe be a bit more aware of them. So as well as the proportion of books in KU, also pricing and average length and reader expectations in terms of series and standalone and stuff like that. In the case of your KU, the thing that you were discussing, I'd be interested to look at those other books which were in KU and see if they were at all similar to yours, because what we do see in some categories, Matty, is that they're almost a bit biphasic, where you'll see one tranche of books which are one way, let's say they're KU, and they tend to be priced at $3.99, hypothetically. But then there'll be another tranche of books which are wide and priced maybe at $5.99. So it's like the category can have more than one identity at the same time. And these things happen to be in the same category, but perhaps the readership crossover isn't very high, or, So it's good for you to see those things, but you can also go into the category and have a good look and say, well, these other KU books are actually not very similar to mine. And when I'm looking at the also boughts for those books, actually, they're not really my kind of books. So I'm happy staying wide, for instance.
Yeah, it would be nice if some of the services or industry experts who up until now have been giving advice on how you can get 10 categories for each of your books could shift their focus to say, okay, now you only have a more limited number of categories to pay attention to. And here's the data to look at. And here's what you might do about it. Because I think that's the tricky part. There's what's the data you have, which obviously you're very familiar with. And then what do you do based on what you're seeing? Like if our difference is good or difference is bad, or if you're an outlier, do you need to fix that, and so on?
Yeah, it's the subdivision, the subdivision within categories that I think I spend a lot of time thinking about and talking to people about. It's the category is often just a very general picture of what's going on in the neighborhood of your book. And sometimes you need to dig down a bit and find out what's going on in the houses next door, so to speak. So the books that are really like yours, because quite often, as I say, you can have categories which will have a small number of very well-known books in them, say James Patterson or Lee Child or something like that. But those books are not at all representative of the rest of the category. And, they're not necessarily doing things that you would want to emulate because they're operating they might be trad published, or they might be by people whose name has a lot of traction. So they aren't necessarily ones that you want to emulate. So for listeners, I'd always sort of say, start with the category and then drill down and really look at the individual books within the category that are like your books. There was one other thing actually that I wanted to pick up on that we were talking about before, and that is the suggestion in the KDP email that I got, and I think you did and a lot of other authors did, saying that new categories would appear in the self-service structure within 24 hours. So to me, that suggests that Amazon are planning to introduce some new categories, and two, that we should keep an eye out for them in that self-service structure. It would be great if we were to get an email saying, hey, we've just added this new category. If it's a good fit for your books, you should totally go and check that category out. That would be awesome. But I wouldn't hold my breath waiting for that email. I hope I'm wrong, but again, for listeners, I'd suggest that you check you don't have to do it every week or something like that, but for the next month or so, I would suggest keeping an eye on that category structure, particularly in your local environment, in your neighborhood, and seeing if there are any additions, because I'd be picking that there will be a few. As I was saying, Matty, I'm going to rerun this big crawl of all the categories, so we'll have a picture every few months or so. And it'll be really interesting. So 6 months from now, it'll be very interesting to see what category changes have been made, I think.
Yeah, and it does seem as if this is not something that you should, you're saying don't worry about going in there every week and seeing what's new, because among the, I think, 5 guidelines, the tips for choosing categories that KDP provides, some of them are pretty obvious. Choose accurate categories, for example. Add fewer categories, which they've kind of enforced with a free category limit. Focus on subcategories, which we've also talked about before. And I think earlier when I was saying about I can really focus in on my category mates, it would be the placements. I would think it would be the placement level where people would want to be really focusing their attention, not the category like mystery. That's too high. Select eligible categories, just like basically Amazon saying, please do things that make sense. But the 5th one that I thought was very interesting was give your categories time to perform. So kind of a caution that going in and swapping out categories is not going to give you time to get traction in a particular category. So it's almost discouraged from you going there and tweaking every week or a couple of weeks.
Yeah, very much so. And I think that category structure is mostly of benefit to us because it helps Amazon know who to put our books in front of. As many have said in the past, I don't know this, but I've always been a weeny bit skeptical that readers actually think, I want to read a mystery book, and they go and browse by category and look at the top 100 and then sort of choose one. Yeah. I'm not sure that that's something I'd love to know, but unfortunately only Amazon knoweth. But my intuition is that category structure tells Amazon who to put our book in front of, using the carousels and the various other methods, lock screens and so forth. And what Amazon wants to do is to put our books in front of people who have the most chance of buying them. So the more metadata and the more sort of background information we can give Amazon through enlightened choice of categories, the more likely that is to be successful for us and for Amazon. There was also the implication in that email and in the support page that Amazon would remove your book from categories if they weren't a good fit. And I've seen a few people talking about this. I think we need to wait and see just how likely that is and how much it happened. I haven't heard of it actually happening to anyone yet, although I'm sure it may have. But I wouldn't get too worried about it at this point. I think if there's egregious miscatting and readers complain about it, then I think that might be an issue. But other than that, it seems a little unlikely to me, Matty, that Amazon are going to go and remove your book from categories unless readers kick up a fuss about it. And if readers kick up a fuss about it, you probably shouldn't be in that category anyway.
Yeah. Well, I can imagine that they must have some kind of analysis running that says if you've picked, paranormal, psychics, crime fiction, murder, and vegan cookbooks, that it's probably user error. It's probably not someone saying, oh, you know what the other really good category would be is vegan cookbooks. It's
seems
probably
unlikely.
just like some odd click. And so, I can imagine them kind of sweeping through and saying, okay, these groupings of placements or categories make sense. If we see things that are outside those kind of commonsensical groupings, we're going to take a look at those. But I also have to say, and I just had Dave Chesson of Kindlepreneur on the podcast fairly recently asking him about this, and the idea that, Amazon has all our book content, and I'm just waiting for the day when I don't have to pick my categories, or I have the option of letting Amazon pick them, because I feel like both the goal that I and my potential readers and Amazon all share is to get the right books into the hands of the right readers. And they have a lot more data to do that with than I do. And so if at some point they said, we're just going to apply AI or whatever, we're going to put your book where it makes sense based on the content we're seeing and the, I don't know, the blurb, the cover, whatever it might be. There are some things like that I just think a machine can do a lot better than I can. And so I'm kind of looking forward to that.
Yeah, well, you could certainly do it now. You could certainly suggest categories based on just simple things like title and blurb and so on and so forth, right? And you're right. In some ways, it's a little surprising that though that category chooser thing doesn't come kind of pre-selected, saying, hey, we chose some categories for you based on the book description that we think are a good fit, but, go and change them or whatever. That's a reasonable thing to do. I would love to see, if something like that did happen, I'd love to see if it results in increased sales or a better customer experience. Because remember, Amazon, and I know this is something that Dave underlines a lot, Amazon cares about the customer experience first and foremost, which is understandable. So a better customer experience in this case might be books getting in front of people who are more likely to buy them, which seems plausible. But remember also that the category structure is very large and it's evolved over a long time. So I think if something like that were going to happen, there might need to be a sort of a rationalization of it, and some categories might need to be removed, or some things might need to be combined entirely. So I don't know. We shall see. The other thing I think that some were talking about was summarization of customer reviews as something that was kind of displayed at the bottom of a book details page. You'll see with some books, in some situations, there are customer chosen tags, I think they're called. There's been a few experiments with choosing things that summarize the book, like a couple of little words or phrases or something down the bottom. Now, this only appears if you're logged into the Kindle store. It doesn't appear if you're browsing anonymously, which is interesting. And I had been expecting that function would be rolled out much more broadly, but then it sort of went away. So I think that there are changes going on in that space, but I think it's probably going to be another 6 months before we see anything major.
Yeah. I think there are lots of changes coming. And the other thing we had chatted about before that I just thought was interesting, I hadn't looked at it in this detail before, was ACX. So coincidentally, I had to go into ACX to do something. And I said, I sent you a note saying, I happen to be checking my books on Audible and noticed that the Ann Kinner books are categorized as mystery, thriller, and suspense. Thriller and suspense. That was one of the books. Mystery, thriller, and suspense. Mystery. And literature and fiction horror. 3 of the books in the series were
Yeah.
categorized as literature and fiction horror, which is really just not right. And all the books in the Lizzie Ballard series were categorized consistently as mystery, thriller, and suspense, which makes sense. But
Yeah.
I would hope that the categories would be consistent, could be
Yeah,
consistent,
well,
at least optionally, between the 2 platforms.
yeah. So here's a question, Matty. What are you going to do about it?
Well, I decided that once I got my handle around what was going on KDP, on Amazon, then I would go to ACX and say, how can I get these into categories that are as similar as possible? Because when I went into
Mm,
ACX, as I recall, there wasn't really the same kind of option of
no,
selecting the
no.
categories as there is on KDP.
Yeah, yeah. I thought they sort of just inherited some things from EP, and other than that, they just didn't use those structures nearly as much at all.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I
yeah,
started
interesting.
thinking, how long have my books been categorized as horror, and how many sales am I losing of audiobooks
Mm, mm,
because
mm,
people don't want horror? Like, they're not horror. I don't know
mm,
where that came from. So,
mm. And we imagine that people aren't. Maybe this is a hypothesis, but we imagine that people aren't browsing and accessing Audible titles in exactly the same way that they are accessing Kindle titles. So I wouldn't be surprised if the category experience is quite different. Whether it's better or worse, I don't know. But yeah, that's interesting. If do let us know, please, if you get a reply about that, because it might be that they're rolling out connected changes to ACX at the same time. And
yeah.
I suspect a lot of people will be in the situation that you were in, a lot of authors, where they actually won't think about it very much unless they just happen to go in there and be tooling around doing something else.
Yeah, and the odd thing about ACX, and I'm going by memory now, so I hope this is accurate, but whereas on Amazon, you have to scroll down, you really have to look for the
Mm,
categories in order to find them. As I recall on Audible, it was just like right at the top of the page, like breadcrumbs in a browser string or something like that. So, like right there,
yeah.
it said horror. Well, if I were somebody else, I'd click away from my book too, if I
Yeah.
wasn't looking
Yeah.
for horror.
Yeah, that's the problem, isn't it? That bad categorization here leads to a bad customer experience because someone who is looking for a horror book is going to be disappointed to have your title put in front of them, and
Right,
someone who
exactly.
isn't is not going to click on your book. So,
Yeah. Well, I'll
yeah, okay.
definitely loop back. We should
Mm,
loop back. People should keep an eye on the comments for this video,
yep.
both about updates on the ACX categorization and also what might be going on in non-US markets. So, Nat, any final thoughts you'd like to add about the new KDP categories?
I think for me, as we were saying earlier, Matty, a lot is still not known about the system and how it's going to work going forward. I think the general consensus in the author community that I've been a part of is cautious optimism, but what will happen in the next 6 months is still not clear to us. So I'd caution anyone against getting too worried. And the advice that Amazon has on the support page is still very good. Look at the categories, choose appropriate ones, and try not to fiddle with things too much. And I think watch this space and see what happens in the next 6 months.
Yeah, I think that is great advice. So, as always, so fun to talk to you, Nat. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been great.
And looking forward to seeing some comments from our listeners and viewers on their thoughts about this as well.
Yeah, sure thing. Take care, everyone.